Torture in Syria, sentenced in Germany. Under universal jurisdiction, a former officer of the Syrian regime has been jailed for life, convicted in a German court of crimes against humanity. Will this judgment change the way war crimes are prosecuted under international law? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the life sentence for Anwar Raslan. The stories of survivors are harrowing. For almost 2 years, a court in the small German city of Koblenz has heard horrifying accounts of how Anwar Raslan ran a Damascus detention center known as Hell on Earth. That court has now sentenced the former Syrian colonel to life behind bars, guilty of murder and unspeakable acts of cruelty. The judges say his crimes were systematic and part of the Assad regime's response to the uprising that became a war. The trial is the world's first criminal prosecution over torture carried out by Bashar al-Assad's regime, and Raslan is the highest-ranking Syrian officer to be convicted of crimes against humanity. The verdict is a legal recognition of the suffering inflicted on victims and their families. Survivors welcome the court's decision as a victory, but even the lawyer who led the prosecution is all too aware of how these crimes are just a drop in an ocean of atrocities.
It matters to me a lot because I have a feeling that justice is starting to open its doors. It's a small step towards justice that we hope will be reached, holding all those who committed violations, those criminals who killed my son, who killed the Syrian youth, accountable.
We should also consider those 100,000 who are not just a figure, but people who have families, who are also still looking for them. And they must not be forgotten. And that's why every war criminal, both in Europe and in other countries, should be prosecuted and brought to justice.
There can be no justice for crimes of this kind. We can only try to approach justice. And in this sense, we have taken a step today with the verdict in Koblenz. It is only a small step, and it is a step that must be followed by others. However, and this is what is important for us, it is a step in the right direction. Crimes under international law are being punished, and we will continue to work to make sure that it happens.
Now let's take a closer look at who Anwar Raslan is and how his case began. A law graduate, Raslan worked in Syria's intelligence service for 18 years, rising to the rank of colonel. In 2008, he became head of the notorious Branch 251 of the General Intelligence Directorate. Survivors know it as Al-Khatib for its location in Damascus. In 2012, a year into Syria's civil war, Raslan moved to Branch 285, a new state security facility that detained political detainees, most of whom were opposition activists. Later that year, Raslan defected, deserting the regime and escaping with his family to Jordan. In 2014, he sought refuge in Germany and was granted asylum. Raslan was arrested 5 years later after other Syrian refugees in Germany recognized him and lodged police complaints. His trial began in April 2020, and since then, more than 100 hearings were held. On Thursday, Raslan was sentenced to life in prison for being found guilty of 27 murders, cases of sexual violence, and being a co-perpetrator of torture. Well, for his part, the former colonel denied all charges against him. He insists he tried to help some detainees during his time at the detention center. Following the trial, Raslan's lawyer said his client was being punished for the sins of the entire Assad regime.
The defense makes no secret of the fact that we are not satisfied with the verdict. At the end of the day, and even if the court viewed it differently, taking into account a personal guilt, Mr. Raslan was ultimately convicted here on behalf of the regime. The question of personal guilt and attribution was the core element of the proceedings here. The defense did not see this personal guilt and also this attribution.
Joining me now is Syrian human rights lawyer Anwar al Bunni. He was the first to recognize Raslan in Berlin as the man who had detained him in 2006 in Damascus. He served as a key witness in the Koblenz trial. Thank you so much for being with us. Tell us first, what your reaction was when you heard this verdict. Life in prison for a man that you helped identify as a perpetrator of torture.
Thank you. Welcome to you and all the people who are watching us. In fact, I was so happy. It's not something personally for me. I am so happy for the victims who me and other organization and Syrian and international organization help him to have part of justice. The reaction of the victims, the reaction of the people who heard from like this man was our award, in fact, our prize. I am so happy for justice because
Okay.
this the first time. Yeah, this is the first time.
It is. It's historic. And you know that,
Yeah.
and I congratulate you in part for being responsible for some of this. But tell me, what impressed you most about how this case was prosecuted, and what, if anything, actually frustrated you about the process?
In fact, I have role as many. I identified him in the first, and I was the first witness who gave his testimony to the prosecutor first, and we helped to achieve or contact many victims for the prosecutor before they arrested him. So we achieved more than about 12 victims who already I defended them when they were in the detention place in Syria. I was there as lawyer and I helped and defended them. So I know most of the victims. I make this contact between them and between the prosecutor to give their testimony. And so for that, it's not personal issue. My goal, my enemy, not Anwar Raslan or else. My enemy holds the regime, holds this machine killing. The Syrians arrested them, tortured them, killed them under torture. That my enemy, really.
Okay, and that's actually a bit surprising, I have to say, that you don't think Anwar Raslan is your enemy, even though you say he was the one behind your kidnapping and detention in Damascus. You ultimately hold the regime responsible for his actions, and the regime is your enemy. And that's actually what the defense argued, that he is being prosecuted unfairly on behalf of the regime. Is that what's happening?
No, the systematic machine who killed the people, Anwar was one very big piece from this machine. For that, my enemy owns this machine. For that, I want to charge hold this machine with all the person. I don't care about person as his committed this crime. I care about him when he is part of this machine. For that, I didn't agree with that defense that Anwar Raslan don't responsible because there is order, because like these crimes don't give any excuse to people who say, oh, somebody give me order. No, like these crimes, it's committed by and guilty if you committed it and you know you are part from this systematic killing.
So he is still personally responsible for his actions.
Yeah, for sure. And the court identified all the point that Anwar Raslan speak about it in his defense. And they, besides that, they said there is no any sign this guy, he defect on the regime. He's still working with the regime. He's still part of this machine. He's still working with the same killing machine, still killing the people in Syria and arrested the people and killing them under torture.
Okay.
For
Anwar
that, he
al Bunni.
responsible.
I hate to interrupt you, but unfortunately the clock is against us. Thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Really a pleasure to speak to you. Well, let's broaden out our discussion now. And joining me from Berlin is Wafa Mustafa, a Syrian activist campaigning for the release of detainees in Syria, including her father, Ali Mustafa. Payam Akhavan is a former UN prosecutor and professor of international law and senior fellow at Massey College, University of Toronto. And from London is Steve Crawshaw, the director of policy and advocacy at Freedom from Torture. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, Wafa, we saw an unprecedented conviction, a life sentence, which is the most severe under German law, but you describe it as the first, and I'm quoting you, little step. How much is missing? What more needs to be done for you to feel a true sense of justice?
Well, thank you, first of all. I mean, this is a very difficult question, and I think this is the question that all Syrians, yesterday and every day, are trying to address and deal with. But I mean, as I said, I thought and I still think that this trial and this verdict is very important. It's just the very, very beginning. I think that at least, I mean, to me, its importance comes from very different reasons. But if we are asking about what is missing, I mean, a lot is missing. To make it clear and short, what is missing? A comprehensive solution to the situation in Syria, a comprehensive solution to the crime of detention and enforced disappearance, not only practiced by Assad regime, but also by other actors in the country.
Okay, just quickly though, I mean, how much did it mean to you to know that victims finally had a chance to face a perpetrator of torture in a court?
I mean, it means a lot. I was myself detained in another security branch in Damascus in 2011. So I think it gives this sense of hope that one day I myself might get this agency over my own story and my own trauma and my own experience.
Indeed, very moving. Payam, let me turn to you. Does this conviction and sentence under universal jurisdiction actually change the game for international justice, that it's no longer really at the mercy of either the UN Security Council and even the veto power of certain nations and their own political interests?
Well, Andrea, there are very few success stories in the quest for accountability against crimes against humanity. So I would say that this is a significant step forward, even though so much remains to be done. We have to bear in mind that the UN Security Council twice vetoed a resolution referring the situation of Syria to the International Criminal Court. Russia, in particular, vetoed that resolution. The Syrian courts are certainly not going to hold anyone accountable, so that really leaves universal jurisdiction as the only alternative. And I think the German authorities have to be commended for having expended resources in order to prosecute those perpetrators who are on their territory. And in fact, under international human rights law, states are under an obligation to exercise jurisdiction over those who have committed crimes such as torture.
Okay, so you're saying it's the only alternative, but then what really are the shortfalls? Because when you say it's the state's responsibility to take up this jurisdiction, there's only a short list of states, mostly in Europe and the US, that claim this universal jurisdiction.
Well, the most obvious shortcoming is not only that there are thousands of perpetrators, but also that those who are most responsible, those in the highest levels of the leadership of Syria, are not likely to be arrested in third states and be subject to prosecution under universal jurisdiction. But we have to start from somewhere. And some accountability is better than none at all. And we have to remember that accountability, sometimes they say justice delayed is justice denied. I like to say that justice delayed is justice delivered, because when it comes to international crimes, when those who are the perpetrators are still in power, you have to have a long-term perspective and hope that through engagement and determination in the long run, those who are responsible will be brought to justice. And I think that Germany's engagement in this matter will help in the long run keep the issue alive. What every authoritarian regime wants to do is to sweep things under the carpet and ensure that they're forgotten. So this is a very significant step towards ensuring that these crimes are not forgotten.
Right. It is difficult to get the balance between what victims want and what's realistically possible under the law. Steve, let me talk to you, though, because I want to ask you about the damage done when crimes like torture are not prosecuted. How can it hurt not just, the personal recovery of victims, but the recovery of entire communities and even countries?
It's hugely important, which, to pick up what the two other speakers were saying, it's also a reminder of how important it is when we see things moving forward in this way. But the failure to address, I think, is literally, to use the obvious cliche, it remains a gaping wound, if you like. So freedom from torture, where I now work, where we are working together with torture survivors, and again, what they're saying to us is having some kind of sense of closure by seeing these things being addressed. That is both for mental health, for a sense of well-being, and, as you partly addressed there as well, for the stability of society as well. It's so important. People sometimes used to argue in the past, oh, let's just bury these things. Let's not talk about this. And again, we've seen that that's actually wrong because these things continue to fester. You need to address it. And echoing what we've heard from the two other speakers, this is so fantastically important. Of course, yes, it's only a start, but a start building on other previous things, to be fair. So, 20 years ago was the creation of the International Criminal Court, which was a great moment in itself because crimes were utterly unpunished before. In the meantime, things like Darfur in Sudan and other serious crimes have been addressed within that court, Democratic Republic of Congo and other places. But as we heard, the political blocks on that have also been very significant. And so this universal jurisdiction is a way of unlocking doors that might otherwise be locked. So to go back to your initial question, the damage, if that fails to happen, the colleagues and the survivors we're working with again and again from all over the world, from very, very different contexts, all of them feel that same sense of if we can address this, then that will help move us forward in some way.
Right. Wafa, I can see that some of what Steve said really does resonate with you. I have to ask you, though, about what some Syrian refugees have complained about. They disagree, actually, with these prosecutions because they actually think it discourages other defectors who could give evidence against the regime in Syria. And they say you're kind of taking out a small fish at the price of actually getting the bigger ones. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's not. I mean, I think I've heard many different opinions on that, and I understand it's a very complex moment for all of us, and I don't claim that I have a clear opinion and feelings towards this verdict and this path and these attempts. But I mean, in my own opinion, I think that the fact that Anwar Raslan defected doesn't erase his crimes and the fact that he was actually complicit in crimes against people. And I think that to me, it is very important that we actually still prosecute those who we can actually prosecute. But that doesn't mean that it will stop here. This is not the end. And that doesn't mean that, well, we are prosecuting Anwar Raslan instead of prosecuting Assad. But it is a beginning, and it is, I think, to me at least, it's very clear today that this road, or any road towards any form of justice for Syria and for us, is a very long and difficult and exhausting one, and I think it needs all of us to be patient, and to actually also. I mean, this is why I went to the court when it started, and I protested there with the photos of detainees, because I thought that I need to be engaged in this, and I need to be part of this, not because I think it's all correct and good and great, but also because I think it's my role and my duty to be part of this moment and to express my opinion on it, whether I liked it or not.
Okay. Payam, let me turn to you because I want to move this forward a little bit and ask you, who could potentially be prosecuted next? And could it become problematic? I mean, do you worry that, states might use the right to prosecute under universal jurisdiction as a political tool of sorts?
First of all, responding to the earlier question that you asked about witnesses coming forward, I think that there is overwhelming evidence of widespread and systematic extrajudicial executions, torture, disappearances. So I'm not particularly worried about a shortage of evidence or witnesses. But turning to your question, for the time being, it is not possible to bring people to justice unless they leave Syria and they come to a jurisdiction like Germany, where they are identified by someone, investigated and prosecuted. So the leading culprits who are still in positions of leadership will have to be brought to justice at some point in the future. And we have seen that those who are in power today may not be in power tomorrow. But this raises a bigger question of trying to effect some sort of transition in Syria towards a different political order. And I think our other guests have also pointed to the fact that if you have impunity for such horrific crimes, what kind of future can we expect in Syria? So this isn't just about punishing this or that person, but it's about affecting a wider political transformation, opening the space for some sort of democratic transition, because it's not tenable to simply keep the status quo as it is currently in Syria. So we have to see the question in that broader context. And perhaps the day will come that those who are untouchable today may in fact be brought to justice. We've seen that happen in many other cases. When I was with the Yugoslav tribunal at The Hague, it was unthinkable that one day Slobodan Milosevic or General Mladic would be brought to trial, but they were in fact eventually brought to justice.
Right. Steve, I know you have a lot of personal experience with those same prosecutions against the former war criminals in the former Yugoslavia. But I want to ask you about the bigger global picture with universal jurisdiction going forward. Because the reason I ask if it can become problematic, I heard Baroness Kennedy, who investigated the Khashoggi murder, actually warn Mohammed bin Salman about where he travels to, because universal jurisdiction might find him. And that's why I ask if there could be a point where this becomes somewhat complicated and is used potentially as a political tool. Does that worry you going forward? Because these prosecutions are so very important.
Yeah, I mean, as regards Mohammed bin Salman, so the Saudi leader, I think pressure on him, or feeling that he can't go on shopping trips or indeed political trips all around the world, I think that would be no bad thing. And that, in a way, goes back to what you were addressing and what we're just hearing from Payam as well, the sense of getting rid of that incredible sense of impunity that sits there. That is in itself an important step forward. So going back to the former Yugoslavia, which we heard from Payam a little bit, I was working as a journalist at The Independent during that time when the Balkan Wars were underway. And I interviewed Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb leader, in 1992, when there was the very first whispers about possible prosecutions. And I put it to him then, well, might you be on trial? I said, no, absolutely not. I am for peace, he said. It was a complete lie, but he was very, very confident he would never face justice. And even when the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was set up, it still seemed to be just for the little guys. It seemed unthinkable. And actually, it went to the very top. And the more often we see that signal, So the better that is. So what we're seeing in what we've seen in the Syria case yesterday is not yet, of course, the very top. But that was true also of the Yugoslav tribunal, that it started with the smaller ones and then gradually it actually moved up until we ended up, as mentioned, with the big commanders went on trial and were convicted there. So I think that any repressive leader who starts to think, perhaps I'd better not get a plane to place X because they might arrest me, that's actually a real plus, because it also goes, well, in that case, if you want to be able to travel freely, maybe don't do some of the things that you and the people reporting to you have done. That sense of command responsibility, obviously, is incredibly important. It's built into international justice in very, very important ways.
Okay.
Is that actually the most important people are not the people at the bottom. They shouldn't follow orders, and that is disobeying international law if they do so. But the people who are giving the orders and thus setting the pattern, that's where it really stops. And the more people can be, those people can be unsettled, the better it is. And I really hope that President Assad will be looking at this and going, that's not so great. I mean, he still gives the impression of being confident, and of course he has other governments who are supporting him or giving cover, but we need that to be broken, and that's why yesterday was so important, not as a conclusion point, but as a point for moving forward.
Steve, I will have to give you the final word. Very unfortunately, we are out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @D_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.